Hello and welcome to the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter, and I have been your beat reporter covering the Jacksonville Jaguars for On SI every single day since August 2019, and we continue to push forward through yet another training camp together. As always, you can always find our 24/7, 100% free, boots on the ground coverage of the Jacksonville Jaguars when you follow us on social media such as Facebook and Twitter at Jaguars on SI. You can also find us at www.si.com/NFL/Jaguars. All right, folks, tonight we are talking about the Jacksonville Jaguars 2025 preseason finale against the Miami Dolphins. The third week of the preseason is always my favorite because that means the long and merciful preseason is over. 2 more weeks until things get real for the Jaguars in week 1, and really the preseason has always served as, to me, a chance for really a dress rehearsal for the starters, and then a way for other guys to kind of, earn reps, whether it's with the Jaguars or with another franchise after cut day. So the Jaguars dropped their preseason finale against the Dolphins 14-6. Frankly, I'm not even sure they should keep scoring in the preseason, but here we are. They dropped the Jaguars record to 0-2-1 in the preseason. Now, there have been some Jaguars teams that have gone 3-0 in the preseason before that got absolutely smacked once the regular season starts, so I wouldn't read too much into that record. Now, it was an interesting, to me, blend between what the Jaguars are trying to accomplish and what the Miami Dolphins are trying to accomplish. We already knew the Jaguar starters weren't playing. Liam Cohen said so on Thursday. We, of course, were there in Miami. I will say that, Jaguars on SI brings you the best coverage of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Yeah, there were a few really, dedicated people there in Miami, and we were one of them. And while there, Liam Cohen, obviously said that the starters wouldn't play, but they took it a step beyond that. I'd venture to say most of the second-string guys didn't play either. The Jaguars had several dozen players on our inactives list for the game, and a couple of guys who weren't even on the inactive list. I'm thinking guys like Devin Lloyd, Andrew Wingard, Darnell Savage. Like, they weren't on the inactive list, but they didn't play. They merely, dressed out as a form of insurance policy. Just if the Jaguars, for whatever reason, needed some bodies to kind of get through the game. I do think that there were some interesting guys who were on that. To me, the most interesting names were Daniel Thomas and Eli Pinkel. Now, Daniel Thomas, I wouldn't say I was necessarily surprised that he was on the inactive list. I, was speaking to somebody at Jaguars training camp a few weeks ago, and they asked me, if I thought Daniel Thomas would make the team, and I was pretty steadfast in saying, yeah, I do think he will. And I know they added Rayon Lane, and they've said, over and over again how high they are on Antonio Johnson. They added Caleb Ransaw. They add Eric Murray. It is a crowded safety room. It really is. And it's been one of the most competitive position groups throughout all of training camp. But what Daniel Thomas brings is, he's only listed as a safety because he has to play a position. To me, I'm not even sure I'd call him a safety. To me, he's a special teams ace. I think Daniel Thomas is genuinely one of the best special teams players in the NFL. He's a special gunner. That viral clip coming out of him several years ago against the Ravens, fighting through that double team vice and, getting downfield and making a great tackle. That is who Daniel Thomas is. That's who he's been since he was drafted in 2020. To me, every roster needs a Daniel Thomas, a guy who, he might not be your biggest impact player when he plays defense, but he has a very specific role in the team. He has a very specific kind of value that he brings. And because of that value, I always thought Daniel Thomas's place was safe with the Jaguars. And it certainly appears that they agree. It certainly appears that, if you didn't suit up for that game, you're making the roster, in my opinion. And there were several players who did, have to suit up, quote-unquote suit up, who I also think are, going to make the roster. And Daniel Thomas is one of those guys, for those reasons I said. Just an absolute X factor when it comes to special teams play. Now, the next guy, to me, The only real surprise name on the list, Eli Pinkel. And maybe it shouldn't be a surprise. Here's how I see things with Eli Pinkel. He has a skill set in terms of his size and his speed, the whole height, weight, speed factor that the Jaguars are missing in their wide receiver room. They just, simply put, it's not a knock or anything. It's just a reality. They do not have a lot of variety amongst their top 4 receivers. Brian Thomas Jr. has the best size, and that's more so, in terms of height, as opposed to, just general big-bodied receiver or anything like that. De'Ami Brown isn't a massive receiver. Travis Hunter isn't a massive receiver. Parker Washington, of course, is built like a slot receiver. They just simply do not have on their projected 53-man roster many guys with Eli Pinkel's athletic. A variety of factors. That obviously includes, whether they're able to add another wide receiver. That can be, after teams make their cuts. Maybe they look at one for a trade. Obviously, New Orleans Saints head coach Sean Payton mentioned that the Jaguars were in for a trade for Devon. I don't want to screw up his last name, Vele. But you guys understand, that the Jaguars clearly want to add some more size to the position. And it makes sense because they just don't really have it. So if, they go into cut down day and they're not able to add another receiver via an external, process, I think Eli Pinkel is your number 5 receiver. And I think it's because he brings that size, speed, profile that the other Jaguars in the starting room right now don't bring. Now, in terms of what we saw during the game, Jaguars, it was really mostly third-string guys against the Dolphins' first-string guys for the first, I'd say, about quarter and a half, maybe close to it, probably a little bit less than a quarter and a half. But against the Dolphins' otherwise number 1 offense, the Jaguars' deep reserves on defense, on the first 2 drives, you got 2 3-and-outs, you got 2 sacks, forced 2 punts. In 6 plays, the Dolphins only averaged 1 yard per play. I mean, the Jaguars ended the night with 6 sacks. Preseason game against a third-string defense is just not something that you see all that much. And I thought the Jaguars absolutely took it to the Dolphins. For camp, I think that it was a very encouraging showing compared to what you saw when the starting defense made their debut in the preseason against the Pittsburgh Steelers a couple of weeks ago. A lot of people were panicked after that game. The Steelers marched up and down the field on the Jaguars. Mason Rudolph made it look easy. I don't think Mason Rudolph threw an incompletion. And Mason Rudolph, of course, is Mason Rudolph. So that wasn't an ideal game for them. And Liam Cohen himself said after the game, with the loss, I think it was a pretty positive ending to the preseason for the Jaguars. I mean, just seeing how the defense played and how they've rebounded. That is all we have for you guys for today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. Please make sure you follow, like, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And as always, I'll be back next time.